Christ will shine on you. So be careful to live your life wisely, not foolishly. Take advantage of every opportunity because these are evil times. Because of this, don't be ignorant, but understand the Lord's will. Saints of God, my eyes have seen the glory and the coming of the Lord. He's trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. I see him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dew and damps. I can read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamp. His day is marching on.
Good afternoon. My name is Brandon A.J. Davis. I'm the founder of Content Writing Service, and I am so delighted to have you today as we talk with Clayton Powell III and the Reverend Dr. Malcolm Byrd, pastor of the historic Mother AME Zion Church in Harlem, New York. And today our conversation will focus on remembering the life of the iconic preacher, former U.S. Congressman and pastor of the Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York, the Honorable Reverend Clayton Powell Jr. Clayton Powell III, Reverend Malcolm Byrd, welcome to the broadcast.
Good afternoon, Dr. Glad to be on.
I'm excited to have this conversation. I think my joy is overwhelming. I have been anticipating this conversation ever since Mr. Powell said that he would consent to be on this broadcast. I couldn't wait to share it with the world and to let everyone know, especially my friends, close colleagues and friends who are aware of my love and affection for this iconic preacher. I couldn't wait to gloat to tell them I have Clayton Powell's son on this broadcast.
Right on.
And to be able to talk about what this man meant to the world and what he meant to my life, being able to glean aspects of his character, his theology, his protest, his mind from the various books we've read over time. So I'm excited. Reverend Byrd, I pray all is well with you and that you had a fantastic worship today.
All is well. God is good.
That's good news. Mr. Powell, before I start with our first question, I just want to ask you if you can provide a context for our conversation. Can you share with me your thoughts about your father, his impressive career, his legacy of political and community service?
Well, the first thing you need to know, but the first thing anyone needs to know about my father is that he was a preacher and that he was rooted in the church. And that was the heart and soul of his foundation. And you think back, we're in a difficult time now, but you think back in the Depression in the 1930s when he really began his ministry and began his work with the community. And that was a difficult time. There were people who had no place to stay, nothing to eat. And the church provided both. There was a soup kitchen, which they opened. There was one of the deacons was the point person for people who had no place to stay. They renegotiated rents with landlords because, after all, better to get some rent than nothing. And that was the foundation on which he later built its political and global activism.
As a politician, when would you say that his career as a politician initially began?
He always, well, certainly in my memory, he was always a politician, but in his discussions of how he arrived at where he was. I mean, my memory begins around 1950 or so. He'd already been in Congress 6 years then. But his description of how he saw politics as an instrument of community service, an instrument of advancement, an instrument of how to make people's lives better, specifically our people. And you, again, go back to history, go back to 1930s, 1940s. Jobs did not come easily. The New York City bus system, buses ran up and down through Harlem. They didn't hire anybody other than white drivers and conductors. And so they protested by stopping the buses. They would block what was then 7th Avenue, now it's Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. So the buses couldn't go through Harlem. On 125th Street, middle of Harlem, one of the main streets of Harlem, the stores along 125th Street did not employ black people. And so my father had a slogan, don't buy where you can't work. And one by one, starting at one end of 125th Street and working its way west, one by one, protesting and picketing, got every single store and restaurant and other places of business to hire people from the community. So this is something which, as people read much about him in the history books, which mainly talk about the 1960s and 70s, people don't understand how crucial the church was and walking up and down in the streets of Harlem for activism. I remember growing up. I was growing up maybe 6, 7, 8 years old when I was old enough to stay up. And every Saturday night, my mother and father and I would start at 138th Street. The church is on 138th Street between what was then 7th and Lenox. We'd start at the corner of 7th and 138th Street and walk south on the west side of the boulevard. And it's hard to imagine now, but there was no entourage, no armed guards. Just walk south, all the way down to 110th Street, where Central Park begins. Turn around, go to the east side of 7th Avenue, and walk north, back up to 138th Street, stopping into a lot of the restaurants and bars and beauty shops, barbershops. And later, I realized that the New York City police actually were in the shadows. They didn't want anything to happen. And it became obvious one night when there was a guy sitting on the curb, brown paper bag, and he's taking a swig from the brown paper bag. And he saw us coming, and he sort of got up to his feet, and he said, "Adam," and he extended his arm out with the paper bag. And suddenly, a couple of police officers came out of nowhere. And my father was like, no, okay. He said, "Adam, have some with me." And I don't know whether it was Thunderbird or whatever it was. And my father said, "Oh, my man, it's really for you. You should enjoy it." But that was it was a neighborhood. It was a community. And I don't think it's quite like that now. I don't know when it stopped being that way, but in the 50s, you could walk around, everybody knew you. Certainly they knew my father. And that was really the foundation. In fact, it must have been 1957 or 58. He decided that having hearings about housing and about schools and about job discrimination should not just be taking place in the halls of Washington, D.C. And so he actually had hearings in the streets of Harlem. And so people would be up on the fire escapes watching. And it was something which I don't think it had happened before, and certainly hasn't happened since. But it's being based in the church, rooted in the community, and then you move forward from there.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing to be able to hear you talk about your father. Reverend Byrd and I have had many conversations about Reverend Powell, and we've read about this great preacher. And for us, we're childhood preachers. I was called a preacher at the age of 9. Reverend Byrd, what age were you when you?
I was 14.
14 years old. So here we are. And I preached my initial sermon at 14. My pastor knew I had the calling at 9. My uncle knew I had the calling at 9. So they allowed me to do what we used to have, Sunday school programs. Mm-hmm. There used to be an annual recognition of the Sunday school. And they would let the little church preacher get up and say a word for the Lord during the Sunday school recognition program. And throughout the community of Warsaw, North Carolina, various churches who knew my grandmother, who knew my grandfather, who knew my aunts and uncles, heard that they had a nephew who was a preacher, so they allowed me to practice my gift. But as I began to read, I went to a historically Black middle school here, and I remember our library having all of these amazing books about these iconic historic figures. And it was shocking for me to see a section actually, of iconic African-American preachers. And two of the preachers I distinctly remember reading about, the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And seeing these figures and reading the books, but then I also remember being enticed to want to look at the pictures first. And as I got older, I would go back and reread the books because I remember studying the pictures and just trying to figure out what was he thinking when they took this picture? What was happening when they took this picture? And then being able to go back and read it and to learn, seeing pictures of Adam being on the streets of Harlem, not surrounded by guards. You are hard pressed to find a celebrity preacher today on a public street just by themselves. I don't think you would find a Thomas Dexter Jakes walking the streets of Harlem, New York, if it wasn't a global pandemic by himself. Somebody would be with him and you would know who that person was. But in the 30s and the 40s and 50s of New York City, a bustling city full of people, full of everything, culture, crime, life, everything. Here is the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell walking the streets among the people. This is amazing. Mm-hmm. Reverend Byrd, what was your first introduction to Reverend Adam Powell?
First of all, thank you, Dr. Davis, for allowing me to be on this broadcast today, and to be here with Adam Clayton Powell III is indeed a great honor for me that I will not soon forget. In all honesty, I don't know of a moment in my life in which I did not know the name of Adam Clayton Powell Jr. I grew up in a proudly Afrocentric house. And in our home, I knew all the words to Lift Every Voice and Sing before I could write or spell my own name. I knew I was named for Malcolm X. I had an understanding of Black nationalism early as a child. And the synonymous nature or the contextual weaving of names such as Adam Clayton Powell Jr. and Malcolm X I knew those names growing up. First of all, my grandparents, before they were married, lived here in Harlem in the early 1940s. And I remember my late grandmother, who fell upon sleep a few years ago at the age of 93, talk at length about the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. She did not prefix his name with Congressman Powell or Councilman Powell. She regarded him as Reverend Powell. And to speak to what you said a moment ago, that to really first deal with the genius of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., you really must first begin with the church. He was not just a preacher, but he was also a preacher's son. So growing up in the parsonage at New Haven of the Emmanuel Baptist Church, to moving here to New York City, he grew and came of age within the conceptual framework of the Black church that did its best work at pavement level for pavement level people. So when you look at, let's say, the Abyssinian Baptist Church here in New York City, at the time that Adam Clayton Powell Sr. was appointed as the pastor, the Abyssinian Church was located downtown. I think it was on 25th Street, I think. And in 1923, the building project began on the current building here in Harlem, completed in 1924. I actually have an original program for the dedicatory exercises for that church, for that building in 1924. But Abyssinian Baptist Church was not interested in just building a large sanctuary to accommodate a lot of people. They were interested in also building a community center, in building space within this mammoth edifice to create intentionally a sense of community within the neighborhood. And so this conceptual framework, largely, in my opinion, inspired, as my grandmother would call him, Reverend Powell, inspired Reverend Powell to do all of the many and various things that he would do over his long and illustrious career, because he was rooted in the church. I most certainly agree with that. And so that is, without question, my first real glimpse of who Reverend Powell was.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I'm jealous because I've been to the state of New York, but I've never been in New York City. And it's one of my goals and desires to come to the city. And so, Byrd, we've already made plans.
Oh, yes.
As soon as it's safe to move a bike, I will be heading to New York City so I can go and see some of these iconic places that I've read about. Our first question, I would like to point it to you, Mr. Powell. Our first question is, if alive today, what would ACP Jr.'s opinion be regarding the level of race tension and violence in today's society?
Well, first, I'll take the violence first. I mean, as we all know, we have all these young people who are running in the streets. There's no other way to say it, and shooting each other. This is just what they're doing is destroying not their future, our future. And so, yes, the level of violence is something which has to be addressed, and he would address it. He did things which, in retrospect, sound almost crazy. There was this wasn't in Harlem, but it was in Haiti, and the democratically elected leaders were being thrown out. We happened to be there. I was, 7 years old, I guess. We happened to be there when the democratically elected leaders were being replaced, dictatorship. And the American embassy sent a car and said, Congressman, you have to leave. It's not safe. And he said, no, I have to go and see what I can do to help the duly elected Haitian government, the leaders of Haiti, see what I can do. And we went, it was after sundown at that point, and we drove to the leader, I guess he was the most senior person in the government. And there was a gate, and they wouldn't open the gate. And so we're in this car, and the driver from the embassy is getting nervous. Congressman, you have to leave. It's not safe. It's dangerous. These people are violent. And he said, no. He was wearing a white suit, and it was a bright moon. And so he got out of the car, and the driver said, no, what are you doing? He got out of the car, and he stood there for a moment. I think what he was doing, and he took out a cigar, and he lit it. And I think what he was doing was to let everyone know who he was, so they wouldn't accidentally shoot him or something. Then he walked over to the gate, opened the gate, and walked up the driveway to, I believe it was a senator, to the political leader's front door. And as he walked up the driveway, there were cars parked on either side of the driveway. And as he walked up the driveway, the headlights of the cars would go on as he passed them. And it was, intimidation, trying to, it was a standard method of trying to frighten people. And he just kept going, got to the front door, locking the front door. Senator came to the door and opened the door. And I was still in the car, but I could see he was looking back and forth. He said, you're here, eh? And I was, yes. And he told him, he said, look, it's not safe. It's really not safe. You should leave, and we can talk later. And so my father said, okay. And he turned around, puffed on his cigar for a minute, and walked back down the driveway. And as he walked back down, the headlights went off. He walked back down, got in the car, went to the Port-au-Prince airport, and returned to New York. And my father said that later that night, the person whom he'd met had been killed. And that's one example. I mean, it's just things that, and you're not going to see that, I don't think, in any history book. The things that he did, I'm going a little far afield here, but the things that he did outside the United States are almost unknown. When I had the honor of meeting Nelson Mandela shortly after he was released from prison, Mandela asked to see a certain number of Americans, and he wanted to see Arthur Ashe. He wanted to see, of course, the leaders in the United States, so the anti-apartheid movement, people who had gone to jail protesting at the South African embassy. And one of the people on his list was Quincy Jones. And as luck would have it, or something else would have it, Quincy likes to keep saying, there are no accidents, there are no accidents. I happen to be an executive producer for Quincy Jones Entertainment. I just started. And I called, I was on the East Coast, and I called Quincy's house. And Quincy said, you have your shots? And I said, what shots? He said, oh, we're going to South Africa. I said, when? He said, Friday. This was a Wednesday. And in those days, you needed a visa. And so I flew from the East Coast, he flew from the West Coast. We met in London and flew down to Johannesburg. And as we were going through customs, we had hit baggage claim, because Quincy said, oh, they lost my bags. Somebody came up to us and said, Mr. Mandela will see you now. And Quincy said, "Oh man, oh I know they lost my bags. I've been in the same clothes for 2 days. Mr. Mandela will see you now." "Oh, okay, I heard that." And they escorted us out, and we get into a car, and we went to what was then the leading hotel in Johannesburg. And Mandela was in the mezzanine holding a meeting of what any political writer would call the shadow cabinet, people who became cabinet ministers after Mandela was elected president. And so you had Kosatu, the representative of the trades union. You had, as I said, around the table, all these people. And so Mandela gets up, and of course he recognizes me. "Oh, Mr. Quincy Jones," and he said, "Oh, this is Adam Clayton Powell, executive producer." And Mandela looked at me, "Mr. Clayton Powell, your father was Mr. Clayton Powell." I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh, I knew your father. Oh, what a wonderful man." My father had never told me he knew Nelson Mandela. He's never written that he knew Nelson Mandela. You won't see it in any history book. But that was part of his African activism. When Ghana became the first independent country after being a British colony, my father was there. He used to have a 8mm movie camera. Actually, I have it here downstairs. And he took home movies of Nkrumah and other African independence leaders on the beach. And as well as, of course, in more formal ceremonies. So he made a point of not just Africa, but recognizing that the future of the world was going to be largely in the hands of what had been colonies, and the colonies were becoming independent. I'll just give you one more international story because I'm going up sort of a far afield. The first time I really understood how important my father was, I was 7 years old, I think. And he had told us that he was going to go to Indonesia. What for? He said, well, there's going to be the first ever conference of non-aligned countries hosted by Indonesia, but Nehru is coming from India, Zhou Enlai is coming from China, people coming from all over Africa, all over Asia, and nobody is representing the United States. In fact, President Eisenhower, Secretary of State Dulles, did their best to try to convince my father not to go. And they wouldn't let him formally represent the United States. So what he did was he got press credentials as a reporter for black newspapers, for the Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, Amsterdam News, Afro-American, paid his own way, and arrives in Bandung, Indonesia. Huge conference hall, and there's film and video of this. And since he was the American who was there, certainly the highest ranking American anywhere near the conference, he knew that he would be asked to speak. And this was after people from the Soviet Union said, oh, the United States, terrible place, segregation, racism, violence, lynching. And speaker after speaker saying, oh, the United States is terrible. And they said, now we recognize Mr. Adam Clayton Powell from the United States. And he went to the podium and he said, there's nothing you said which is not true. Conditions are very difficult, but they are better than in Moscow or Beijing or Peking then, because we're improving, we're trying to do something about it. And we don't see you're doing that. Well, this was not what people were expecting in Indonesia, and it certainly was not what people were expecting in Washington, D.C. So the moment that is vivid in my memory is I was seven years old. And my father came home. We met him at what was then Idlewild Airport. Now it's Kennedy Airport. And we went home, and my parents allowed me to stay up to watch the 11 o'clock news. And so we were watching Channel 4, the NBC station, and the anchor began the newscast by saying, "What kind of a day has it been? It's been a day that Adam Clayton Powell returned from Indonesia to a hero's welcome in Washington, D.C. and New York." And he had a standing ovation in Congress. And so I was looking at this. I'm 7 years old. I'm looking at this. And I looked at my father, looked at my brother, and said, "Wow, this is a big deal." And I said, that's the first time I actually began to understand what he was doing globally. I'd grown up seeing what he was doing on the streets of Harlem, but this is the first time I'd seen what he was doing globally. And it all followed. I'll just give you one more example. When Menachem Begin became Prime Minister of Israel, he flew to New York to, of course, meet with American leaders, first in New York, then Washington. And he asked to see three journalists. I was at CBS News at that point. He asked to see Walter Cronkite from CBS News, Barbara Walters from ABC News, and me. So I didn't know what he wanted, but Walter and I got in a taxi and went across town to the hotel where the Prime Minister was staying. And Walter started looking at me. What's he doing? What's he doing here? We went up to his suite. The three of us are sitting on a couch, and he came in, and Walter and Barbara are both sort of pitching heavily. "Oh, you have to be a guest on my program. Oh, we want to interview you." And finally he said, "Oh, all right. I'll do both of your programs." And in fact, that was the famous split screen interview where Cronkite interviewed Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, and that was the beginning of the of Egypt recognizing Israel, and Sadat was later assassinated. And so Begin gets up, the three of us get up, and we start to the door, and he said, "Mr. Clayton Powell, you stay." Well, Walter and Barbara started looking at me, "Boy, what's going on?" And so they leave. Begin gets up and he closes the door. He said, "I could not come to the United States without greeting a hero of Israel, the son of a hero of Israel." And he embraces me. And then he said, "Thank you for coming." He opens the door and I leave. So I went downstairs to the hotel lobby to a pay phone, and I called my mother. I said, "What just happened?" And she said, "There are things that your father has done which no one will ever know." I'll give you a quick PS to the Mandela story. When Mandela first came to the United States, July 2nd, I think it was, of 1993, to accept the Medal of Freedom from President Clinton, I sent a fax to Shell House, to the African National Congress headquarters in Johannesburg, inviting him. The ceremony at the White House would be at 12 noon, inviting him to spend the morning at a public event which I would arrange in Arlington, Virginia. And as my father always used to say, what's the worst that can happen? They say no. Well, to my incredulity, I get back a phone call from the ANC office in Washington saying, our president would like to accept your offer. And so the morning of July 3rd, he was to do a public event in a rooftop conference center here in Arlington, Virginia. And someone who was much smarter than I said, why don't you go over to the hotel? He was staying at the Jefferson. Why don't you go over to the hotel and make certain that he leaves on time, because we're going to have C-SPAN and CNN and a lot of other people carrying this live. And I said, good point. So I went over to the hotel, and I'm in the lobby, and one of the ANC people comes through, and he said, oh, Mr. Clayton Powell, why are you here in the lobby? Why don't you come up to the suite with us? I said, oh, all right. So I go up to the suite. This is now about 8 o'clock in the morning. And there's Nelson Mandela sitting on the edge of his bed in his pajamas watching Sports Center on ESPN. He loved sports. Had been an athlete. And he said, oh, Mr. Clayton Powell, please come sit next to me. So I'm sitting next to him. He said, perhaps you can help me with a problem. And I said, well, I'll try, certainly. Your Secretary of State, Mr. Warren Christopher, has called and said we should Thabo Mbeki. Thabo, what did he say? He said, we should blow you off. Turned out Secretary of State had an auditorium full of people at the State Department who he had promised would see Nelson Mandela before Mandela went to the White House. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay. I said, well, of course, you should accept the Secretary's offer if that's what you want. That's a great honor. Now, of course, you are the president of the African National Congress, and you'll be meeting with the President of the United States this afternoon. Our Secretary of State is the equivalent of the Foreign Minister of the African National Congress. And he said, yes, you're right. Thabo Mbeki was then foreign minister. Thabo, you will go see the Secretary of State, and I will go with Mr. Clayton Powell. Well, of course, Warren Christopher never forgave me, but it was a recognition and a recognition of a relationship which I never knew he had with my father. But I've run into those relationships all over. It's remarkable how much unheralded, unwritten, never in my father's autobiography, but all these things that he did all over the world, as well as, but always rooted in Harlem and the church.
That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. These are stories that you are absolutely correct. We've never fully been able to glean these stories. I want to ask Reverend Byrd the question, if alive today, what would be Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Opinion be regarding the level of race tension and violence in today's society?
Well, thank you so very much for that question. I think all one would really need to do is to take a look at the types of things that the late Reverend Dr. Powell was saying and the types of things that he was doing. If we were to go back to 1941, of course, with his election to the New York City Council, the first person of African descent to hold a seat in the New York City Council. If you look at 1944, when he first ran for Congress, when he ran for Congress here and won here in Harlem, one of his key platforms in 1944 was anti-lynching. He actually ran on a platform where, if you elect me, I'm going to go to Washington to ensure that white supremacy will no longer be able to lay hold on Black people. You elect me, I'm going to do all I can to stop white supremacists from killing black people all over the South, and in some cases in the not so South. That was his platform. We must also historically acknowledge that at this time, William Dawson from Chicago was already in Congress. But Powell ran with a purpose to slay white supremacy as much as he possibly could. He was a Democrat. He knew he'd be going up against Southern Dixiecrats, who were the main and primary segregationists of the day. If we were to also lift up again, emphasize again what has already been stated earlier on, look at what he was doing here in Harlem. He was all about economic justice for black people. The bus strikes was 1941 here in New York. If you go back a little bit further, let's talk about 1939. His protests regarding the 1939 World's Fair that did not employ any black people in any of the things associated with the World's Fair. He was interested in liberation for our people in every sense of the word. Here at Harlem Hospital, crying out not only for black workers to work at Harlem Hospital, but demanding that black physicians be also treated with respect as they worked here in Harlem Hospital. If you look at what has been going on today regarding our racialized tension and what has been happening in streets all over the country, which was lifted up, I don't think enough, but it was lifted the other day in the debate, there is a reason why young black activists are in the streets today. There is a reason why, in some cases, some of them have armed themselves, some of them have not armed themselves. There is a reason. And if you were to look at economically the types of businesses that were mostly affected in many of the protests, in many cases, they were places like drugstores, grocery stores. People were literally stealing milk and taking things to feed their children. It speaks to a larger issue in our culture and in our society. If you were to go to the 1960s with the birth of the Black Power movement, one of the most predominant leaders of the Black Power movement of the 1960s was the Reverend Dr. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was always talking. If you read interviews and read transcripts, he was always talking about hanging out with Stokely Carmichael and these new breed of cats and the Black Panthers, as it were. He was often standing with highly militarized Black Panthers to get his point across regarding the need and the cry for Black power in the midst of a sick and racist society. When someone asked him, what is Black power? The first thing he said was, Black power means Black dignity. It means that we are no longer going to let you dispense dignity to us. We're going to demand our own dignity and our own respect one way or another. And so if you were to ask my humble opinion as an Adam Clayton Powell Jr. enthusiast, if he were here in 2020, where would he be? He would be with the Black Lives Matter activists. If anything, he probably would be the leader of the movement right now in the streets, on the microphone, encouraging the next generation to keep their hand to the gospel plow and not turn back.
You're absolutely correct. Reverend, you are absolutely correct. When I think about reading in the history books how his activism went beyond the pulpit, is one thing I think today's preachers, and I say this, Mr. Powell, because again, Reverend Byrd and I come from a very different generation. We are one of the few who are tied to Black Methodism and who are tied to the traditionalism of the church. And I say that to preface my statement in that the pulpit for Reverend Adam Clayton Powell was not something to be used as a bully pulpit, but also as a megaphone in itself to sound the clarion call for justice and equality within the community. The preacher was, in many respects, the first place you learned about protest. You learned it biblically, and then you learned about it socially with a conscience to do something about it. And so remembering Adam Clayton Powell in this regard, that's the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about this generation, is that if alive today, he would be on the street. Go ahead, Mr. Powell.
You're absolutely right. You're both absolutely right. And let me add to what Reverend Byrd was saying, that he not only was in the street in the Black Power. In fact, going back, you could actually make a case that he was the first person to use the phrase Black Power. What do you want? Black Power. When do you want it? Now. But he also tied it back into the church. And a lot of people in Abyssinia weren't too comfortable with that. He invited Malcolm X to come to Abyssinia Church to speak. And I remember one of the deacons saying, "You're inviting that man to come?" And he said, "Yes, and we should all be listening to him." You talked about some of the others that he knew and who reinforced each other. Something else which I've never seen described is that on Sundays, and that's the only time I would have seen it, because maybe during the week he would have had it in the office, I wouldn't have seen it. But on Sundays, some Sundays, there would be a conference call of all of or many of the different Black leaders around the country. Now, this is when, now we can do video like this. But in those days, to do a conference call, you had to set it up way in advance. You had to have operators standing by. And so there would be this conference call of different Black leaders discussing strategy. What are we going to do this week? How are we going to do it? And my father's position always was, he said, "Remember, I'm the really bad person. I'm going to be the burr under their saddle. They're going to want to get rid of me so much, they'll do business with you." And that was to whether it was NAACP or Whitney Young or somebody else, but you could see this kind of actual coordination, including the media. There are some reporters. A good friend of both of my parents was Mike Wallace, and he used to say, "Your father has such a sense of media. It's just remarkable." And so they would actually, the different Black leaders would actually sit and say, "Okay, how are we going to coordinate our media strategy?" And critical to that was the Black press, which was the only part of the media which were reporting a lot of these, the lynchings and the violence in the South and terrorism, and trying to get the attention, trying to get the story told in the white media, New York Herald Tribune, New York Times, CBS, NBC, so that white people in America could not escape but see Bull Connor's dogs attacking innocent protesters.
Absolutely.
Seeing what happened to the bus carrying the Freedom Riders after it had been firebombed. And that this would break the silence that had enabled the immorality and the violence. And this didn't happen by accident. It was thought out, was based in the church, churches plural, based in the communities around the country. Which is another thing. He was at home anywhere in the country. I traveled with him a few times, a small fraction of his schedule. He used to have, this was in the days before Xerox, he used to have his travel schedule done on carbon paper. And whenever he was traveling, one of the carbon copies would be up on the kitchen wall. So I could go next to the phone. So I could go and look and say, oh, today he's in Tallahassee. And so when he came back, he would, of course, he would always turn it into a lesson. You know where I was? In Tallahassee. Can you find that on the map? Do you know why Tallahassee is important for the state of Florida? And also sometimes he would joke about some things I probably shouldn't say publicly. But he would say, "Can you imagine somebody actually named a place such and such?" It's like my grandmother came from South Carolina, and she always used to say publicly she was from Spartanburg. But I knew, because my grandfather told me, he said, you know, my grandmother's not from Spartanburg. She's from Cowpens. And so my father would joke, say, you imagine naming a place Cowpens? But he built that, starting with the church and starting with Harlem, he built a national foundation. I learned to type starting when I was 6 years old in my father's office in Washington, D.C. I typed, I was addressing envelopes for press releases. And so most of the releases, yes, some, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune was also on the list. But most of the envelopes I typed were going to Black newspapers, going to Jet, going to Ebony, going to the Black press, because we all knew that's what would carry the word. White press, maybe, maybe not, but the Black press would carry the word.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that national network, and of course the network of churches,
yes,
all over the country.
Yes.
This you don't really see in the history books that kids study in schools an appreciation of what that was and the role that network of Black organizations and religious organizations played in the Civil Rights Revolution and in Black Power. And
let me interject real quick before Reverend Byrd. Let me interject before Reverend Byrd has to go. I know he has a different schedule time. I want to ask Reverend Byrd, and this may be a tedious question. I hope it is, but let me just ask: as a political agitator, how would Adam Clayton Powell Jr. respond to a Trump presidency?
Well, all one has to do is take a look at how the late Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. responded to the presidents of his age. He was always in a position where he was intentionally pushing the envelope, where I think that to get a rise in many respects out of many of his colleagues in Congress, he would intentionally operate defiantly, knowing that his constituents here in Harlem would have his back, regardless of what position he opted to take in Washington. However, by the 1960s, Reverend Congressman Powell becomes the chair of the Commission on Education and Labor.
That's right.
That commission, we don't really talk much about it, but the Powell chairmanship of that commission really gave us many of the civil rights things that we in many respects now enjoy. He was able to push that through, not just because of his seniority, but the savvy nature in which he was able to engage with persons and pull them to his side of the opinion one way or another. You can look at his relationship with President Kennedy, but where this and the committee's work really began to take root was under the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson, though many of the civil rights legislation came through under Lyndon Johnson was not the poster child of white understanding concerning the Black predicament.
That's right. That's right.
He understood politically certain things needed to be done because he understood the age in which he was in. But Lyndon Johnson was literally a racist in moderate clothing. Make no mistake about it. But Adam Clayton Powell Jr. knew how to engage with Lyndon Johnson, even when that Southern Texan Dixiecrat nature of Lyndon Johnson came out. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was able to engage with him, to make his point very clear, and to craft legislation in such a way that he was not at all lessening himself by the way in which he framed it, but he did it in such a way that he knew that these pieces of legislation would pass. And I forgot the number. I think it was 49 or 50 pieces of legislation that committee passed through that committee in record time. You boiled that down to food, persons being able to get food in impoverished Black and minority neighborhoods, Medicare, access to health care. He was dealing with this in the 1960s, and we're still having to deal with that even right now. Without question, the biggest thorn in the side of a Donald Trump in 2020, if Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was alive, would be in Adam Clayton Powell Jr. There is nothing about a Trump presidency that would keep Adam Clayton Powell Jr., the historical Adam Clayton Powell Jr., silent. He would be within the spirit of the late John Lewis and others, but he would be very active, not only with his congressional seat, making things happen within Congress, but he would be very active here on the streets of New York. He would be very active wherever there was civil disobedience. I can assure you, he would be in Louisville, Kentucky right now, pulling together every Black group who were interested in Breonna Taylor receiving justice for being murdered in her home. He most certainly would be there. And the last thing I will say about Adam Powell and Trump, he would be actively engaged in identifying the successor of Donald Trump. He would be a part of those group of Black leaders who would literally determine who the next president of the United States would be, and to encourage others to get behind him, without question.
I agree wholeheartedly. Mr. Powell, what would you say your father's response? I know the time is getting almost to the hour mark, and I want to try to ask one more question before Reverend Byrd has to go. But what would you say your father's response would be to a Trump presidency?
Well, one thing I think that Reverend really put his finger on is legislation. Lyndon Johnson wound up sending my father a letter saying that never in the history of the United States Congress had any committee chairman not just been able to get bills out of committee and onto the floor, but every single bill that he sent to the floor of the House of Representatives passed. So one response that I'm sure he would have is legislation,
Yes.
new laws. And he would work with, I guess it would be Chuck Schumer now in the Senate, to make certain that not only they passed, but they passed in a way that the president could not veto it. I mean, that's. He used to say, "Come on, we're talking about power here." And so that's one thing that I'm certain he would do. He used to. I was only able to watch him once do this, but he had a jacket that was made 2 sizes too big, and he would have the different bills that had been passed by his committee in 4 pockets inside the jacket, and he would lean on the railing in the House of Representatives, looking around the House floor. And I asked him, I said, "Well, what are you looking for?" He said, "I'm 3 votes short. I'm looking for 3 more votes." And he said, "Oh, my good friend over here, I think I'm going to go get his vote." He went over, he put his arm around him, took out a cigar, came back. "Now I need 2 votes." He was able to get 1 more. He said, "Okay, now I need 1 more vote." And he looked over and he saw somebody, I think he was from Alabama, segregationist. And I said, "There's no way you could get his vote. He's a Dixiecrat segregationist. He won't even talk to you." And I said, "Oh, no. Let me see if I can reason together with him." And he went over. He offered him a cigar. He said, "No." And then he said something very quietly, and the guys would stop. And he came back. And I said, "You got his vote?" And he said, "No, but he's agreed to go off the floor. Now I'm going to introduce the bill." And he walked down the center aisle, and he said, "Mr. Speaker, I want to introduce the Aid to Higher Education Act of 1965, and I call for an immediate vote." And he had to deal with the speaker, and the speaker would say, "All right, the clerk will now call for a vote." And my father he never lost, because he'd always counted the House. And so later I said, "What did you tell your good friend from Alabama that made him walk off the floor?" And he said, "The elections are going to start changing in your district, and you can have me campaign for you, campaign against you, or ignore you. Your choice."
Oh, I love
Wow. Wow.
That's
amazing. That's amazing. That's amazing.
Hey, Dr. Davis, now we know how to do things on the floor of the General Conference now. Now we know how to count the House.
Absolutely. And listen, I cannot wait until the General Conference of the AME Church convenes in 2021, so I can go to the stage and start counting the House.
Oh, yeah.
And maneuver these votes that we want in our favor. Absolutely.
Yes.
I know your time is limited. I want to thank Bronson Elliott Wood, who had just gave us the person's name. He was talking about Congressman Rankin. Your father was talking to Congressman Rankin, and he just mentioned, thank you, Bronson, it was 70 pieces of bedrock legislation.
70, thank you.
70 pieces. 70. That is amazing.
I was 21 off. It was 70. That's
70 pieces that this man was able to successfully engineer and legislate.
Yep.
Through Congress. I mean, that is amazing. You don't see that kind of work done today. Let me ask real quickly.
Let me just add a quick PS. And most of the people, I mean, yes, it comes from Harlem, comes from the church. But a friend of mine in California said, What most people don't understand is that most of the people who benefited from your father's legislation were white.
Yes.
They were poor white or women suffering from discrimination. My father wrote the first black lung legislation.
Wow. Impressive. Impressive. Let me ask before you have to disappear, and I know Reverend Elliott has to go, but let me just, Reverend Byrd has to disappear. You have another engagement to keep. What does a path forward look like embracing what we know about Adam Clayton Powell Jr. as a community leader, pastor, politician? And we're kind of prepared to sign off here. I'll let Reverend Byrd go, and I would love for you to end this, Mr. Powell.
I think wholeheartedly that the Black church and the Black community not only owes a great debt of gratitude to the life and work and the witness of Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., but we also still have a lot to learn about him. As you mentioned earlier, Dr. Davis, I do not at all believe that he used the pulpit of, let's say, Abyssinian as a bully pulpit, as much as he used it as an intentional place of information, where Sunday morning at Abyssinian Baptist Church with him as the pastor was in many respects a university course in liberation for our people. He's preaching about Jesus as the liberator. He is keeping at the forefront of conversation with the parishioners and the persons in the community what the latest issues of the day happen to have been, because we all know that what we see now in current media now, that typically inspires activism as we know it. There are people who will show up at a march today simply for the Facebook or the Instagram cred, not because they're actually interested in what has brought or the purpose rather of why that demonstration was possible. In those days, media outlets in the 1940s, with the exception of the Black press, as the Amsterdam News, of course, the Defender in Chicago, I forgot the name of the paper, the Sentinel, I think, out in Los Angeles, and other papers all over. With the exception of the Black news, mainstream white media was not really interested in the fight for human liberation and dignity concerning Black people. So where did they get this information? They got it from their pastor, who also happened to have been a city council person, who also happened to have been the congressional representative from this community. So for Dr. Powell, for Reverend Powell, there was no discombobulation between the political and the ecclesiastical. He knew wholeheartedly that for Black people to be liberated, you needed a little bit of Jesus and you needed a little bit of political power as well. And he used both perfectly in order to bring liberation for our people and liberation, as has just been stated, for marginalized people all over. Most of the people who benefited from that committee's work, you're right, were poor white people in West Virginia. So poor whites in West Virginia benefited greatly from Powell era legislation through that committee. The question now is, for those of us who admire the name of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., how interested are we in committing ourselves to the same type of work from our own pulpits? No, all of us can't be Congress representatives. All of us can't serve on the city council, but we can at least try. We can at least ensure that the persons in our congregation are politically engaged, that they know what's going on in their local community boards, that they understand that they have the tools necessary to make a change in their community. Let's also go back and deal with the fact that Upon his first election to the city council in 1941, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was the pastor of America's largest Protestant church. Abyssinian just wasn't a neighborhood church. It was the largest Protestant congregation in America. Now, there is some debate regarding First Baptist, Southern Baptist Church of Dallas, Texas. I won't even attempt to deal with that. But for the most part, Abyssinian was the largest insofar as membership Protestant congregation in America. He knew that if he said something in the pulpit at Abyssinian at 11:45 in the morning, by 1 o'clock, it was news all over the homes of Black people here in Harlem, and in many respects, all over. He recognized that he had the seat, he had the platform, and he used it. So in my opinion, the way forward is the Black church must get back to this type of Black liberation activism and work. Someone said, I think it was the late Gardner Taylor, I heard the late Reverend Dr. Gardner Taylor talk about Reverend Powell, and he talked about this one time in which he stood in the pulpit of the Abyssinian church during election time, and he said, now I can't tell you who to vote for, but I can tell you, if God were here, God would vote Democrat. And I heard Reverend Taylor share that story in my hearing, and I never forgot it. You aren't telling people how to vote, but you are reminding them to engage in as much as they possibly can in the fight for human liberation and dignity. So for those of us who love his legacy, let's pick up the baton and let's do what we can to ensure that people in our neighborhoods are not only employed, but we want to ensure that our people are not underemployed. Let's not only work to help the down and out, let's help those who are up and out, because it's not just about soup kitchens and clothing the naked these days. It's how do you help that Black professional who is a graduate of Harvard Law School, who has all the connections that they need to have, but they are still receiving pay at a lower grade than a white person who has less the credentials that they have. So let's engage ourselves. Let's use the pulpits that we have to, in the spirit of the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr., to not only keep the faith baby in the midst of a faithless culture, but let's do all that we can to ensure that Black power isn't just a statement of the past, but that Black power is a very real part of our present.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mr. Powell, can you tell us what this is? Your father. This is the man that we've only been able to read about and to gain understanding from pictures and the various clips on YouTube. But can you tell us, what does the path forward look like embracing what we know about Adam Clayton Powell Jr.?
Well, I thought Reverend Byrd stated it very well, but I would just add one thing, which is never, ever give up.
Yes.
Keep moving forward. And I'll just give you one quick anecdote. He was famous or notorious, depending on your point of view, for proposing the Powell Amendment. And Democrats and Republicans would say, oh, why are you proposing that amendment? It was very simple, that no federal funds could go to any institution that discriminated.
That's right.
Oh, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Oh, you're just going to doom that piece of legislation. And he kept introducing it, never passed. I remember one night, we were getting ready to go to bed. We were in Puerto Rico. We had a little fishing shack in Puerto Rico. And he said, I've got it. I said, got what? He said, I know how to get the Powell Amendment passed. I said, how are you going to do that? Those segregationists will never pass that. And he said, I won't call it the Powell Amendment. I'm going to call it Title IX. And today it's Title IX. That's
right. That is amazing.
That's awesome. That is awesome. That in itself just puts the icing on the cake, because when I read about in Will Hager's book about what your father was doing with the Powell amendments, people thought that he was losing his political mind, but he was turning the wheels of his political genius by making sure that whatever was going on, and I know that he received calls, according to the autobiographies, he received calls from senior ranking members of Congress. He even received calls from the president of the United States of America telling him to stop attaching these Powell amendments. But the genius of Adam Clayton Powell was that I'm not going to allow federal funding to go to places that did not promote equality and fairness. I mean, this man was beyond his time. I'm grateful to see the conversation about him come to light, particularly surrounding the TV series Godfather of Harlem. The only, and Michael Byrd, you and I had this conversation before. Yeah. I'm a stickler for the truth, and this may seem juvenile or unimportant, but when talking about my favorite icon, let's get the facts of his life together.
Let's get it right.
Powell did not smoke cigarettes. He smoked cigarillos. Is that correct?
Right. That's right. No cigarettes. So I was offended looking at that. I was offended.
Actually, you know who called me upset about that TV series? He called me 3 times. Charlie Rangel.
I'm sure. I can believe it. We're neighbors. We're neighbors. I'm very sure he did. And my issue with the series is that it only showed the late Reverend Powell from one perspective. And it did not in any respect embrace the totality, the political titan that he really, really was. It did not showcase his brilliance. It did not show his masterful ability to pull people together. It really didn't even show his incredible popularity here in Harlem among his constituents. And so how he was depicted is good for ratings, but it's not at all good for historical accuracy.
Well, if you want to see something, just 2 things that are historically accurate television, they're on YouTube now. One is a brilliant documentary that was done, now it has to be probably 1990, 1991. It's just called Adam Clayton Powell. And it ran first in theaters. It actually was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary of the Year. That's the one time I got to go to the Oscars. And then it ran on PBS on American Experience. But it was really well done. And the other is a movie which my brother and I co-produced for Paramount called Keep the Faith, Baby. And Harry Lennox just did a brilliant job.
Amazing.
So, yep. Well, we thought that the medallion was lost for years. And it turned out that my father had hidden it. The day that my father died, he died at 4 a.m. in my hospital in Miami. And I caught the first plane over to Bimini at 7:30, whatever. I went over to the house and I thought there was a bird sitting on the window, but no, somebody had punched a hole through the window, which the FBI used to do to the house, this little house that he had here in Washington. And he would call J. Edgar Hoover. He said, I heard him one time do this on speakerphone. He said, J. Edgar, my man, your boys are over at the house again. Oh, Congressman, we had to investigate a threat against your life. He said, well, the next time they should know the key is under the mat. But somebody had punched a hole through the front window of the house in Bimini. And they had taken everything, not money, not valuables, but all of his papers. And they're sitting in some warehouse somewhere. And so we thought that they had taken the medallion. Well, it turns out before he went to the hospital, my father had hidden the medallion in a plastic, thing you put food in, like a baggie or something. And then he took the plastic baggie with the medallion in it, and he put it in a can of paint. And it was only recently that somebody in Bimini opened the can of paint and tried to use it and discovered there was this object inside.
Oh my goodness.
And so Now we have the medallion.
Where is it now?
Where is it?
My brother either has it or has it secured.
Wow. As
Wow.
long as the family has it, that's all I care about.
Absolutely.
Dr. Davis and I have been
Absolutely.
talking about this medallion for years, and of course, he'd be the one to turn up with a perfect replica of it. Of course, we have talked about this medallion for years.
I've spoken with the gentleman who created the medallion for Harry Lennox, and it was some years ago. And I was just doing the research, haven't watched the movie Keep the Faith, Baby. I was just Googling to see, did anybody turn up with the medallion? Is it in the museum? Did the family have it? And everybody said the medallion is lost. And so Googling early one night, I found the guy who created the medal, and he and I were talking. I'm looking through old emails, and I connect with him to see if it was still for sale. And it was. He said, if you want it, I can make it for you. And I began to talk to him about who I was and me being I idolized Adam Clayton Powell, loved the guy. And through several conversations, next thing I know, I got a package in the mail, and he has sent me a replica of the same one that he made for the movie. And not only did he send me this one, he sent me two. Mm-hmm. And so I have another one, which to honor my friend and brother, the Reverend Malcolm Byrd, I am FedExing him the other copy.
Right on, my brother. Right on.
And so, there are many persons who I have enjoyed conversation with, talking about Adam Clayton Powell, but Malcolm and I, we can go on for hours talking about who this man was. And I want to thank you both for being available, Mr. Powell. You have no idea how much this has meant to me, that you have made yourself available to provide these stories we never heard about your father and his international work and his character and legacy in foreign places. Malcolm, it's always a pleasure, my brother, to be with you. We are members of the Black Methodist Church. We're members of the Masonic Order. We're members of Alpha Fraternity Incorporated.
Right on.
So we are heirs of the legacy of Adam Clayton Powell. And we just want to say thank you, Mr. Powell, for being available. Before we conclude this conversation, Mr. Powell, could you tell us, knowing what you know about your dad, how would he, and given the context of social justice and political involvement, how would he define unholy silence?
I think he would define it as silence in the face of discrimination, in the face of evil. I mean, his father, my grandfather, one of his most famous sermons was cheap grace. Mm-hmm. You need to speak out, you need to struggle, and there just can't be an alternative.
Mm-hmm. Right on.
Wow. Reverend Byrd, can you define for us, knowing what you know about Adam Clayton Powell, how would you define unholy silence?
Unholy silence for the late Reverend Adam Clayton Powell would undoubtedly be choosing not to speak in order to shore up your own comfortability. You're silent, but your silence lacks the divinity that God gives to all of us. And that is part mind, part voice, part ingenuity. So for him, an unholy silence is when a person has a voice and refuses to use it to lift themselves up out of wherever they might find themselves. Side to that, I would say that in the midst of this struggle in which we are experiencing as a people, I think he would say to all of us concerning silence, period, he would say to all of us, find our own Bimini, find our own fishing cottage in Puerto Rico, find our own cottage or residence in Oak Bluffs, Find whatever place of solitude you can to recharge and refresh yourself, because all of us who are interested in justice have many more miles to go before we sleep.
Wow. I want to thank you again, Adam Clayton Powell III, the Reverend Dr. Malcolm Byrd, pastor of historic Mother AME Zion Church in Harlem, New York, for being available and for having this conversation with me. It has been a tremendous blessing to be able to talk to you two gentlemen about this amazing man whom I love dearly.
Yes.
I would like to end this broadcast sharing just a thought concerning the Reverend Adam Clayton Powell. We know that he died from cancer, but we also, from the book of Will Haggard, talking about the life of Adam Clayton Powell, he was fishing and he finally caught a major fish. And he struggled with that fish, and it is thought that from having struggled trying to reel that fish in, that he may have ruptured or caused some internal pain, bleeding, as a result of him already having issues relating to cancer. But he kept fighting in the midst of pain and in the midst of excruciating discomfort because he wanted to win the goal. As you look at life and you look at the struggles that we have with us today, the end goal is doing something about what we see. You cannot be satisfied with just being sympathetic towards the injustices that take place in your community. You must do something. You must say something. And you cannot affect the world in what you do and say, but by opening your mouth and speaking truth to power within your community, which is your world, you have done something. It's not always about the quality or the quantity in which we try to affect change, but it's the quality of our efforts to affect change that make the difference. The thought for the week, which I'm sharing for the rest of this month, we owe it to our future to not only change the institutionalized systems of racism, but also to redirect our attention toward a collective advocacy. Change is not inevitable. In the end, it is our actions that must model the more excellent way, not complicity with racism, violence, and hate that marks our contemporary social order. This has been Conversations with Faith Leaders. I want to thank Adam Clayton Powell III, Reverend Malcolm Byrd, for taking time out of their schedule and being with me today. And we look forward to sharing with you next week as we talk about ministry in a global pandemic, the expectations and the lessons we've learned. Thank you for tuning in, and God bless you.
The roof on the American dream is on fire. The roof on the Church of Jesus Christ is on fire. And we don't need no water. I think we need to let it burn. As the song says, burn, baby, burn. America needs to burn off its racism, burn off its hatred, burn off its self-complacency, burn off its self-righteousness and self-aggrandizement. This country doesn't belong to one particular race of people.